You don't think of yourself as someone who struggles with support. You just handle things. You figure it out, you manage it, you move forward. And most of the time, it works. People rely on you. Things get done. Nothing really falls apart. So it never feels like a problem. If anything, it feels like strength. But what's easy to miss is this. It's not just that you can handle things alone. It's that you've learned to default to it. Before you consider asking, you've already decided to manage it yourself. Before someone can step in, you've already figured it out. And over time, that stops being a choice. It becomes automatic, quiet, consistent, unquestioned. Because when you handle things alone, you don't have to adjust to anyone else. You don't have to wait. You don't have to explain. You don't have to risk being let down. Everything stays predictable. And that predictability starts to feel like stability. But patterns like this usually don't form randomly. They tend to develop when relying on others didn't always feel as steady as relying on yourself. And once that connection forms, you don't just become capable. You become someone who doesn't think to reach for support at all. You don't actively reject help. You just don't reach for it. When something comes up, your first instinct is internal. Let me handle this. Not after you've tried other options. Not after you've asked around. Immediately. It happens quickly, almost without thinking. Before support even becomes part of the equation, you've already stepped in to manage it yourself. It often looks like solving problems without involving others, processing things privately, minimizing what you might need. But it also shows up in quieter ways, downplaying when something is difficult, not mentioning when you're overwhelmed, adjusting your expectations instead of expressing them. You don't make it visible, so from the outside, there's very little for people to respond to. And because of that, support rarely has a chance to fully show up. From the outside, this reads as competence, and it is. You're capable, reliable, self-sufficient. People trust that you can handle things. But internally, it's something more specific. You've built a system where reliance on yourself feels more natural than reliance on other people. Not just easier, more familiar, more automatic. Because relying on yourself doesn't require translation. You don't have to explain what you need. You don't have to adjust to how someone else responds. You don't have to navigate whether they'll understand. Everything stays contained, predictable. And over time, that containment starts to feel like efficiency, like clarity, like the most direct way to move through things. Not because others can't help, but because depending on them doesn't feel like your default. It feels like an extra step, something optional, something you can bypass. And most of the time, you do. This pattern serves a very clear function: predictability. When you rely on yourself, you control the outcome. You don't have to wait, explain, adjust to someone else's response. And even more than that, you don't have to anticipate how someone might respond. You don't have to read between the lines. You don't have to manage expectations. You don't have to prepare for inconsistency. Everything stays within your control. Clear, direct, contained. And because of that, there's less friction, less uncertainty, fewer variables to account for. So the process feels smoother, more efficient, more reliable. And for many women like you, that predictability becomes stabilizing, not just practically, but emotionally. Because at some point, predictability likely felt safer than uncertainty, safer than not knowing how someone would show up, safer than adjusting to someone else's limitations, safer than depending on something you couldn't control. So your system adapted. It moved toward what was consistent, toward what worked. And what worked was you. Your ability to figure things out, your ability to carry things through, your ability to not need anything to go a certain way. Over time, that stops feeling like adaptation. It starts feeling like identity. This is just how I function. And that's where the pattern becomes stronger, because it's no longer something you do, it's something that feels like who you are. So self-reliance doesn't just become a strength, it becomes the most reliable system you have. The one you trust the most, the one you return to automatically, even in moments where something else might have been possible. This pattern often develops earlier than people realize, not from one moment, but from repeated experiences. Small adjustments made over time. Situations where you learned subtly and consistently what was reliable and what wasn't. For some, it forms when support was inconsistent, help came with conditions, or emotional needs weren't fully met. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it's not neglect, it's unpredictability. Support that was there sometimes, but not in the same way twice. So you learn to read the room, to assess quickly, to adjust quietly, and eventually to stop expecting consistency from others altogether. For others, it develops through role identity, being the responsible one, the one others depended on, the one who had to figure things out early. You become the one who handles things, not because you were told to, but because it made things work. It kept things stable, and over time, that role becomes internalized. You don't just play the role, you become it. The one who manages, the one who carries, the one who doesn't need help. And once that identity forms, reliance on others starts to feel unfamiliar. Not wrong, just unnecessary. And sometimes it's even more subtle than that. There's no clear origin story, just reinforcement. You handled things alone and it worked. Again and again and again. Problems got solved, situations got managed, nothing broke. So the brain starts to recognize a pattern. This works. And more importantly, this is safe. Because safety isn't always about comfort. It's about predictability, about knowing what to expect, about removing variables that can't be controlled. So the system simplifies. Rely on yourself. Reduce uncertainty. Stay in control. And over time, that system becomes automatic, not consciously chosen, just repeated, until it feels like the most natural way to function. So the brain learns this is the safest way to function, not the easiest, not the most connected, but the most predictable. And once predictability becomes the priority, anything that introduces uncertainty, even something like relying on someone else, starts to feel like a risk, even if nothing is actively wrong, even if support is available. Because the system wasn't built around what's available now. It was built around what felt reliable then. The cost of this pattern is subtle, because on the surface, nothing is actually wrong. You're capable, you're stable, you're functioning. Things get handled, life moves forward. So there's no clear signal that anything needs to change. But over time, something starts to narrow, not externally, internally. Your emotional world becomes more contained, not closed off in an obvious way, just more self-managed. You may still have people around you, you may still have access to support, but support isn't something you fully experience because it requires something your system doesn't default to, being seen before everything is already handled. So what often happens is this: people see the outcome, they don't see the process. They see the composed version of you, not the moments that needed support in the first place. And because of that, your relationships can stay functional. They work, they're stable, but they don't always deepen. Not because people aren't capable of showing up, but because they're not fully included. So the pattern reinforces itself. You handle things alone, which means you don't have to rely on anyone, which means you don't have to risk disappointment. But there's a trade-off, because support isn't just about solving problems. It's about being met in real time, before everything is already resolved. And when that part is missing, the absence isn't loud, it's quiet. It shows up as a lack of depth, a subtle sense of distance, a feeling that something is slightly out of reach, even when everything looks fine. So you stay protected from disappointment, but you also don't fully experience what support could actually feel like. Not the idea of it, the reality of it. And this is where it gets a little more nuanced, because none of this means there's anything wrong with you. It means something worked. At some point, handling things on your own became the most reliable option. So your system adapted to that, and it adapted well. You became someone who can figure things out, stay steady under pressure, move forward without needing much. And those aren't small things. But patterns that work early don't always stay neutral over time. Sometimes they stay unquestioned. So it doesn't feel like a choice. It just feels like this is how I function. And for a long time, that may have been exactly what you needed. But when a pattern becomes your default, it can also become your limit. Not in a way that's obvious, just in a way that quietly shapes what you experience and what you don't. Because when you're always the one who handles things, you don't just avoid disappointment. You also miss the moments where you could have been met in it. And most people don't notice that right away because everything still works. Everything still moves. It just doesn't always feel shared. And that's the part that usually takes longer to see. Not because it's hidden, but because it never disrupted anything enough to question it. So the pattern continues, not intentionally, just automatically, until something shifts, not externally, internally, where you start to notice how often you default to handling things alone, how rarely you let someone in before it's resolved. And once you see that, it's difficult to unsee, not in a way that forces change, but in a way that creates awareness. And awareness tends to do something quietly over time. It creates space for a different response, even if it's small, even if it doesn't happen right away. Because this pattern was never about not needing people. It was about learning not to rely on them. And those are not the same thing. And for a lot of women, this is where another pattern starts to show up. Not in how you handle things, but in how you relate to people. And it's a little harder to notice because it doesn't look like distrust. It just looks like distance.